Snow was falling over the Pamir passes the night the merchant Faxian's caravan lost its third camel to the cold, though no one in the party would have called it snow, so much as the sky itself coming apart in slow pieces, drifting down between peaks that had no names in any language spoken, by the men crossing beneath them. Somewhere below, in a valley that would not see full sunlight until well past mid-morning, a fire had been built from dried yak dung and the splintered wood of a cart axle that had cracked 2 days before on a stretch of frozen scree. 12 men sat around that fire. Between them, they spoke 4 languages fluently and understood pieces of 3 more. And this was not remarkable to any of them. This was simply what travel meant, in that century, on that road. A trader from Sogdiana knew enough Persian to argue prices and enough Sanskrit to recognize a fair contract when a Buddhist monk read one aloud. A Chinese silk merchant carried, sewn into the lining of his coat, a small clay tablet with prayers to a Zoroastrian fire god, not because he believed in that god particularly, but because a fellow traveler 2 winters earlier had told him it brought luck on the mountain passages, and out here, in air thin enough to make a man's thoughts go strange and slow. Luck was a currency nobody refused. The fire did not burn long. Fuel was scarce above a certain altitude, and the 12 men understood that survival, on this stretch of the journey, was a mathematics of body heat and patience, of knowing exactly how long you could sit still, before the cold became something more dangerous than discomfort. They did not sing. They did not tell stories, not that night. They ate a thin broth made from dried mutton and melted snow, and they slept in a huddle beneath felted wool blankets that had been traded, bartered, retraded, and inherited across a chain of ownership none of them could fully trace. One blanket had come from a Tibetan herding family. Another had been woven in a workshop outside Merv by a weaver whose name is lost, whose hands are lost, whose entire existence survives now only in the tight, even weft of wool that still, centuries later, if such a blanket had somehow survived, would keep out the mountain wind. This is not a story about silk, not primarily. Silk was the commodity. That gave the road its name centuries, after the road itself had stopped being used for that purpose almost exclusively. A retroactive branding applied by 19th century German geographers sitting in libraries in Berlin, men who never crossed a single mile of the routes they were naming. The road itself, in the centuries when it actually functioned as a living network of human movement, carried something far stranger and far more interesting than bolts of woven silk. It carried people. It carried the specific, granular, human texture of what it meant to be a stranger among strangers, to negotiate a meal in a language you had learned only well enough to avoid being cheated, to fall in love in a caravanserai with someone whose god you did not worship, and whose family you would never meet, to die of dysentery in a town 2,000 miles from anyone who remembered your childhood face. The scholars call it a trade network, and this is accurate in the way that calling a marriage a legal contract is accurate, technically true, missing almost everything that mattered to the people living inside it. What follows is an attempt to walk that road not as a line on a map connecting Lebanon to Rome, but as it actually existed, which is to say as thousands of small, human, physical, emotional, transactional, spiritual, and often deeply lonely encounters, stretched across roughly 17 centuries, from perhaps the 2nd century, before the Common Era through the 15th century after it, when sea routes finally made the overland passages largely obsolete. It is a story about merchants, yes, but also about the wives left behind in Qian while their husbands spent 3 years crossing into Central Asia. It is about the children born in caravanserais to parents who spoke no common language, and who nonetheless built, out of gesture and repetition and shared hardship, something that functioned as a family. It is about disease and debt and the particular psychology of a person whose entire livelihood depends on trusting men he has never met and will likely never see again, in cities he cannot picture, under rulers whose names change with a frequency that would have made any modern person's head spin. The night in the Pamirs eventually gave way to a grey dawn, the kind that arrives not as a sunrise but as a gradual admission of light. and the 12 men rose stiffly, their joints aching from cold and from days on horseback, and they began again the slow work of loading what remained of their goods onto animals who were themselves exhausted past the point where exhaustion still registered as anything but a baseline condition of existence. Ahead of them lay perhaps another 6 weeks of travel before they would reach a town large enough to offer real shelter, real food, and the particular relief of being, briefly, somewhere that felt less like the edge of the world. Behind them, unmarked and already disappearing beneath fresh snowfall, lay the ashes of a fire that had kept 12 strangers from 4 different corners of the known world alive, for one more night, a small, unremembered act of collective survival that would never appear in any chronicle, any customs record, any imperial history. And that was, in its way, the entire point of the road itself. To understand why that fire mattered, and why the 12 men huddled around it came from such different corners of the world, in the first place, requires understanding the peculiar geography and political fragmentation that made the Silk Road not one road at all, but an improvised, ever-shifting braid of routes threading through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. There was no single Silk Road, no paved imperial highway maintained by a central authority. There were instead thousands of interlocking paths, adjusted yearly based on weather, war, water sources, and the whims of whichever local power currently controlled a given oasis or mountain pass. A merchant setting out from the Chinese city of Qian, and in the 2nd century might follow an entirely different route than one departing from the same city 3 generations later, because the political map beneath his feet had been redrawn by the rise and fall of nomadic confederations, the expansion and contraction of Chinese imperial control over the Darame Basin, and the endlessly shifting fortunes of the oasis city-states that served as the road's essential nervous system. Those oasis cities deserve particular attention because they are where the human story of the Silk Road actually lived. Places like Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Turfan, Dunhuang, and Merv were not way stations in the sense that a modern gas station is a way station, brief and forgettable stops between more important destinations. They were destinations in their own right, cosmopolitan urban centers whose entire economic and cultural identity was built around the management of movement itself. A city like Samarkand existed because it sat at a crucial confluence of routes, and its rulers, whoever they happened to be in a given century, understood that their prosperity depended entirely on making the city hospitable, safe, and profitable for merchants to pass through and, crucially, to want to return to. This created a strange kind of urban culture, one organized not around a single ethnic or religious identity, as most pre-modern cities were, but around the practical necessities of hosting difference. Samarkand needed mosques and Zoroastrian fire temples and Buddhist monasteries and Nestorian Christian churches, sometimes within the same city block, because it needed to be legible and welcoming to merchants arriving from Persia, from India, from China, from the steppes, from the eastern edges of the Roman world. The geography itself imposed a brutal discipline on everyone who attempted to cross it. To the north of the main routes lay the steppe, home to nomadic confederations, whose relationship with the settled trading world oscillated between symbiotic and predatory, sometimes within the same decade, sometimes within the same season. To the south lay the Tibetan Plateau, a wall of altitude and cold that made travel there a specialized undertaking few merchants attempted without extensive local knowledge. Directly across the center of the route lay the Taklamakan Desert, a name that, in local tradition, has been rendered as meaning something close to the place you enter and do not leave, a description earned honestly by a landscape where temperatures could swing more than 50 degrees between day and night, and where the shifting dunes could bury a well that had been reliable for a generation, forcing entire trade routes to reroute themselves around water sources that no longer existed. Surviving this geography required an infrastructure of trust that is easy to overlook precisely because it left so little archaeological trace. The caravanserai, the fortified inn where merchants and their animals could rest, was the most visible piece of this infrastructure, and thousands of these structures dotted the routes at intervals, calculated to match roughly 1 day's travel by loaded camel, which meant somewhere between 20 and 25 miles depending on terrain. But the caravanserai was only the physical shell of a much deeper social technology. Long-distance trade across such hostile terrain was not something an individual merchant could undertake alone. Not reliably, not for long. It required networks of trust that stretched across religious, linguistic, and political boundaries. And the mechanisms that built and maintained that trust are, in many ways, the actual hidden history of the Silk Road, more consequential than any individual king or conqueror who happened to control a stretch of territory in a given decade. Sogdian merchants, who for several centuries functioned as something close to the professional class of the entire trade network, developed particularly sophisticated systems for this. Sogdiana, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, was not a unified empire but a collection of city-states. And yet Sogdian merchant families operated what amounted to a diaspora trading network stretching from the Byzantine frontier to the Chinese capital, with resident communities of Sogdian traders living permanently in cities thousands of miles from their ancestral homeland. These communities functioned through extended family and clan networks, through letters of credit that could be honored across enormous distances, and through a shared language and script that, for a period of several centuries, served as something like the diplomatic and commercial lingua franca of the entire route. Archaeological finds of Sogdian merchant letters, some discovered sealed in a defensive watchtower where they had apparently been abandoned or intercepted sometime in the early 4th century, reveal a world of remarkably ordinary anxieties. One letter, written by a woman named Mune, who had been left behind in Dunhuang by a husband, who had gone ahead to conduct business and apparently never returned for her, describes her situation with a directness that collapses the distance of 17 centuries in a way that formal histories rarely manage. She writes of having become, in her words, like a sheep chased by wolves, of having asked local officials for help and received none, of owing debts she cannot pay because the man responsible for her support has abandoned her in a foreign city among people who do not share her language or her gods. That letter, and others like it, point towards something essential about the psychological texture of life along the Silk Road that formal trade histories tend to flatten into abstraction. The road was not simply a conduit for goods. It was a machine for producing specific, intimate human vulnerabilities. It separated husbands from wives for years at a stretch, sometimes permanently, sometimes by choice and sometimes by circumstances, entirely outside anyone's control. Whether that meant death on a mountain pass, capture by bandits, absorption into a new community that offered better prospects than returning home, or simply the slow attrition of a marriage stretched across a distance that made yearly, then decade-long, then permanent absence feel less like abandonment and more like an inevitability nobody had quite decided on. The economic structures underlying all of this were, in their own way, remarkably sophisticated for what modern observers sometimes imagine as a primitive pre-modern world. Merchants operated through partnership arrangements that distributed risk across multiple parties, since no individual trader could realistically absorb the loss of an entire caravan to bandits, disease, or a collapsed mountain pass. Credit instruments allowed goods to be purchased in one city against payment to be rendered in another, months or years later, a system that depended entirely on reputational trust networks since there was no overarching legal authority capable of enforcing a contract between, say, a Sogdian trader and a Chinese silk producer separated by 4,000 miles and half a dozen competing political jurisdictions. Religious institutions, particularly Buddhist monasteries situated along the trade routes, often functioned as informal banking centers, holding deposits, extending loans, and providing the kind of institutional continuity that individual merchant families, vulnerable to death and misfortune, could not always guarantee on their own. It is worth pausing on the religious dimension of this world, because it is easy, from a modern vantage point trained to think of religious identity as fixed and often exclusionary, to misunderstand how faith actually functioned along these routes. Buddhism spread along the Silk Road not primarily through conquest or centralized missionary campaigns, but through the accumulated, incremental movement of monks, merchants, and pilgrims who carried texts, relics, and practices with them as a natural extension of their travel, the same way a modern traveler might bring back a taste for a foreign cuisine or a handful of foreign words folded permanently into their vocabulary. Manichaeism, a now largely vanished religion founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century, found some of its strongest and longest surviving communities not in its Persian homeland, where it was eventually suppressed, but among Sogdian and Uyghur populations, along the eastern stretches of the trade routes, surviving there in some form for nearly 1,000 years after it had been extinguished everywhere else. Nestorian Christianity, considered heretical by the dominant church authorities in Byzantium, found refuge and flourishing communities as far east as the Chinese imperial court, where a stone stele, erected in the year 781 and rediscovered in the 17th century records, in both Chinese and Syriac script, the establishment of Christian communities in the Tang capital, more than a century earlier. What this reveals is a world in which religious identity was neither monolithic nor static, in the way later, more centralized empires would attempt to enforce. A merchant's faith was often less a fixed doctrinal position than a portable set of practices, prayers, and protective rituals, adjusted and layered as circumstances required. It was entirely common for a trader to maintain devotional practices from multiple traditions simultaneously, hedging his spiritual bets in exactly the pragmatic way. He hedged his financial ones, diversifying risk across an uncertain and often dangerous existence. This religious pluralism was not born of some enlightened pre-modern tolerance in the way a modern observer might wish to imagine it. It emerged, more plainly, from necessity, a trade network that depended on cooperation across such vast cultural distances, could not afford the luxury of rigid exclusivity, and the cities that thrived along the route were, almost without exception, the ones that had learned to accommodate difference as a practical matter of commercial survival. By the time the Tang dynasty reached its height in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Chinese capital of Qian had become, by some estimates, the largest and most cosmopolitan city on the planet, home to communities of Persians, Sogdians, Indians, Koreans, Japanese, and Arabs, along with representatives of religious traditions from across the entire breadth of Eurasia. This was the world that produced the kind of encounter described in the Cold Open. 12 strangers from 4 linguistic worlds sharing a fire in the Pamirs, not as an exceptional or dramatic event but as something closer to the unremarkable texture of daily existence for the tens of thousands of people who spent their working lives moving along these routes. It was a world built, quite literally, on the accumulated labor of trust, patience, and improvised communication, stretched thin across some of the most punishing geography on the planet, and held together not by any central authority but by the simple, repeated, human necessity of people needing other people, across every conceivable barrier of language, faith, and origin in order to survive. The physical infrastructure that made this world possible, though largely invisible to modern eyes unless one visits the scattered ruins that survive, represented an enormous and sustained collective investment across many generations and many different political authorities, wells, cisterns, and underground irrigation channels known in Persian as kanats, engineering marvels that carried water for miles through gently sloping underground tunnels to avoid the catastrophic evaporation losses of surface canals in arid climates, made possible the very existence of oasis agriculture sufficient to support the populations that serviced the trade routes. These water systems required constant maintenance, skilled labor passed down through specialized families and guilds across generations, and a level of community cooperation and shared investment that speaks to a sophistication in pre-modern hydraulic engineering that modern observers, accustomed to associating advanced infrastructure exclusively with industrial or post-industrial societies, sometimes fail to appreciate fully. A single Qanat system might represent the accumulated labor of an entire community across decades, and its maintenance, generation after generation, was quite literally a matter of survival. For the oasis settlements that depended on it, the administrative and bureaucratic apparatus surrounding trade, though less visually dramatic than caravanserais or irrigation systems, deserves equal attention as a piece of the infrastructure that made sustained long-distance commerce possible. Customs posts, positioned at strategic points along the routes, particularly at the boundaries between different political jurisdictions, collected tariffs that provided crucial revenue to the various states and city-states along the way, revenue that in turn funded the military garrisons, road maintenance, and diplomatic relationships that kept the broader system functioning. These customs posts generated the kind of mundane administrative paperwork, tallies of goods, valuations, tax assessments, that rarely survives in dramatic form, but that, when it does survive, as in certain caches of documents, preserved by the dry desert climate of the Darim Basin, offers historians an unusually granular and reliable window into the actual scale and composition of trade at a level of detail that more literary or chronicle sources simply cannot match. A single surviving customs register might record, in flat bureaucratic language, the passage of a particular merchant with a particular quantity of silk on a particular date, mundane details that nonetheless allow modern historians to reconstruct trade volumes, seasonal patterns, and price fluctuations with a precision that would otherwise be impossible to achieve. The linguistic landscape that developed to service this administrative and commercial complexity deserves its own careful consideration, because language itself functioned as a kind of infrastructure, every bit as essential as physical roads or water systems. Sogdian, as previously mentioned, served for several centuries as something approaching a lingua franca of Central Asian trade. But this linguistic dominance was neither permanent nor uncontested, and the gradual displacement of Sogdian by other languages, particularly various forms of Persian and, following the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, Arabic, in different functional roles across different centuries, offers a fascinating case study in how commercial and administrative language shifts in response to underlying changes in political and religious power. Persian in particular achieved a remarkable and lasting status as a language of literary culture, administration, and elite discourse across a vast swath of territory, extending well beyond the ethnic and geographic boundaries of Persian-speaking populations, themselves becoming, for many centuries, the preferred language of poetry, historical writing, and courtly communication across Central Asia, Afghanistan, and much of the Indian subcontinent, in a pattern of cultural prestige and linguistic spread that offers useful parallels to the later global spread of other prestige languages in different historical contexts. Legal pluralism represented another defining and often underappreciated feature of this world, since the merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats moving along the trade routes routinely crossed jurisdictional boundaries, governed by fundamentally different legal traditions, sometimes within a single day's travel. Chinese imperial law, with its own elaborate codes and administrative procedures, governed conduct within Chinese-controlled territory. Islamic law, following the 7th century expansion of Islam across Persia and much of Central Asia, introduced its own comprehensive legal framework governing commercial contracts, inheritance, and dispute resolution, one that proved remarkably adaptable to the specific needs of long-distance trade, developing specialized commercial law concepts including partnership structures and credit instruments. That facilitated exactly the kind of cross-cultural, commercial cooperation that trade routes required. Various steppe confederations maintained their own customary legal traditions, often less formally codified than the legal systems of settled agricultural civilizations, but no less binding on those who lived within their jurisdiction. A merchant navigating this legal patchwork needed not merely linguistic fluency, but a genuine, practical understanding of multiple overlapping and sometimes contradictory legal frameworks. Knowledge that, like so much else discussed in this account, was typically acquired not through formal education but through the accumulated, embodied experience of years spent actually living and trading within this complexity. Seasonal rhythm imposed its own discipline on the entire system, since travel across the highest mountain passes and the most extreme desert stretches was simply impossible during certain months, and successful long-distance trade required not merely courage and capital but a precise, accumulated calendar knowledge of when specific stretches of the route became passable and when they closed entirely to travel until the following year. A merchant departing Qian with the wrong timing might arrive at a critical mountain pass only to find it already sealed by early snowfall, forcing a costly and dangerous choice between waiting out the winter in an unfamiliar location, far from home and often far from adequate shelter, or attempting a crossing that experienced local guides would have refused to undertake. This seasonal calendar, refined across centuries of accumulated caravan experience and passed down through oral tradition among professional guides who specialized in particular mountain or desert stretches, represented its own form of essential, hard-won knowledge, one that could mean the difference between a profitable journey and a fatal one. And the specialized local guides who possessed this knowledge commanded fees and respect entirely disproportionate to their formal social status in the broader hierarchies of the societies they served. The story of how this world came into being is usually told through the figure of Zhang, a Chinese imperial envoy dispatched westward around 138 before the Common Era by the Han Emperor Wudi. And there is good reason for this, though the reason has less to do with Zhang's original mission succeeding, and more to do with what his failure accidentally revealed. Wudi's actual goal had nothing to do with trade. He wanted a military alliance against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that had been raiding and extorting tribute from Chinese territory for generations, and he had heard rumors of a people called the Oases, driven west by the Xiongnu, who might be persuaded to join a Chinese campaign of revenge. Zhang set out with roughly 100 men. He was captured almost immediately by the very Xiongnu he had been sent to circumvent, and he spent the next decade as their prisoner, during which time he apparently integrated well enough into Xiongnu life to marry and father children, before eventually escaping westward to continue his original mission more than 10 years behind schedule. What he found, when he finally reached the Oases, was a people who had settled comfortably into new territory in Bactria and had no interest whatsoever in a war of revenge against the Xiongnu who had displaced them a generation earlier. The military alliance Wudi wanted never materialized, but Zhang, on his long and difficult journey home, which included a second period of captivity, brought back something the emperor had not anticipated and had not asked for: a detailed intelligence report on the kingdoms, cities, markets, and trade goods of Central Asia, a region about which the Han court had previously possessed only the vaguest and most distorted rumors. He described the fine horses of Fergana, animals so prized that they would later be called heavenly horses and would themselves become one of the primary motivations for Chinese military expansion westward. He described the wealth and sophistication of Bactrian and Parthian cities. He described, crucially, evidence that Chinese goods, particularly bamboo and cloth from the Sichuan region, were already turning up in Bactrian markets, having arrived by an indirect southern route through India that no Chinese official had previously known existed. This detail deserves particular attention. because it complicates the popular narrative in an important way. Qian did not discover the Silk Road. He discovered that trade connections already existed, informally, unofficially, carried by nameless merchants whose activities had never registered in any imperial record, and that these connections had been operating in some form long before any Chinese envoy arrived to formalize or document them. What Qian's mission actually accomplished was not the creation of long-distance Eurasian trade, but its incorporation into the machinery of Chinese state interest. And this incorporation mattered enormously, because it meant that the Han state now had a reason to invest military and administrative resources into securing and extending these routes, which is precisely what happened over the following decades. Han forces pushed westward into the Darime Basin, establishing garrisons and eventually a system of protectorates that provided the kind of security infrastructure that made sustained, long-distance commercial travel considerably safer and more predictable than it had been. It is tempting and historically lazy to imagine this as a single dramatic act of opening a gate swinging wide and merchants flooding through. The reality was slower, more contingent, and shaped by a much larger cast of characters than any single emperor or envoy. The Qian Empire, which rose to prominence in the 1st century of the Common Era and controlled territory spanning from what is now Afghanistan through much of northern India, deserves particular credit for stabilizing and connecting the southern branches of the route, linking Central Asian trade networks directly into the enormously wealthy markets of the Indian subcontinent. Qian rulers, most notably Kanishk, whose exact dates remain debated among historians but who reigned sometime in the 2nd century, presided over a period of remarkable cultural synthesis, one visible even today in the Gandharan art tradition, which fused Hellenistic sculptural techniques inherited from the Greek kingdoms that had followed Alexander's conquests into the region centuries earlier, with Buddhist religious content, producing some of the earliest anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha, a figure who had previously been represented in Buddhist art only through symbols such as footprints or an empty throne. Meanwhile, to the west, the Parthian Empire, and later its successor, the Sasanian Empire, controlled the crucial middle sections of the route running through Persia, and these empires developed a genuinely sophisticated understanding of the economic value of controlled, taxed transit trade. Parthian and Sasanian authorities did not simply allow goods to pass through their territory. They positioned themselves, quite deliberately, as essential intermediaries between Rome and China, two civilizations that, for most of this period, had only the haziest and most mythologized understanding of each other's actual existence. Roman writers referred to the distant source of silk as the land of the Xi'an, a term derived from a Chinese word for silk itself, and their knowledge of what lay beyond Persian and Central Asian intermediaries remained fragmentary and often fantastical for centuries. This was not an accident. Persian merchants and officials had every economic incentive to prevent direct contact between Roman buyers and Chinese producers, since their profits depended entirely on remaining the indispensable middlemen in a transaction. Neither end fully understood. The scale of Roman demand for silk, once it developed, was substantial enough to generate genuine anxiety among Roman moralists and eventually among Roman policymakers. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complained bitterly about the drain of Roman gold and silver flowing eastward to pay for silk, pepper, and other luxury imports, a complaint that reveals both the scale of the trade and the moral discomfort it generated among a Roman elite that associated silk with foreign softness and a dangerous erosion of traditional Roman austerity. Roman senators periodically attempted to restrict or ban the wearing of silk garments, particularly on men, associating the fabric with effeminacy and moral decline, restrictions that appear to have been about as effective as most sumptuary laws throughout history, which is to say largely symbolic and widely ignored by anyone with the money to acquire the forbidden goods anyway. the mechanics of how silk itself moved along this route, and how its production remained a closely guarded Chinese secret for centuries, offer one of the more genuinely dramatic episodes in this history, though even this drama unfolded slowly, across generations rather than single dramatic moments. Chinese authorities treated the techniques of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms and the processing of their cocoons into thread, as something approaching a state secret, and the export of silkworm eggs or mature silkworms was, according to later legendary accounts, punishable by death. Yet knowledge, unlike goods, is notoriously difficult to fully contain, particularly when it exists inside the heads of individual human beings who might marry, travel, or defect for reasons having nothing to do with imperial trade policy. According to an account recorded centuries later by the Byzantine historian Procopius, it was two Nestorian Christian monks, traveling under the patronage of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, who successfully smuggled silkworm eggs out of China concealed inside hollow bamboo canes, breaking the Chinese monopoly and establishing an independent Byzantine silk industry. A separate and possibly more historically grounded tradition credits a Chinese princess married off to a king in the Central Asian kingdom of Khotan, sometime in the 1st century, with smuggling silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds hidden in her elaborate headdress, an act of what might be called dowry sabotage, since border guards inspecting a royal bride's belongings were apparently disinclined to search quite so intimately as the smuggling required, whatever the precise mechanism. And both stories may contain fragments of truth about a process that likely happened more than once through more than one route. The underlying pattern is instructive. The most valuable commodity moving along the Silk Road was never really silk itself, or spices, or precious stones, though all of these mattered enormously to the merchants who traded them. The most valuable and most consequential commodity was knowledge, technique, and technology, and this moved along the same routes as the physical goods, often carried in the same caravans, sometimes carried more literally in the bodies and memories of the people making the journey. Paper-making technology, developed in China centuries before it appeared anywhere else, spread westward following a very specific and well-documented historical trigger, the Battle of Talas in the year 751, in which Abbasid Arab forces defeated a Tang Chinese army in Central Asia and, according to several historical accounts, took Chinese papermakers among their prisoners of war, who then established paper production in Samarkand, from which the technology spread through the Islamic world and eventually into medieval Europe, arriving there only centuries after the Chinese had already been using paper for the better part of a millennium. Gunpowder, printing techniques, the compass, advances in mathematics and astronomy, all of these moved along the same routes, carried by the same merchants, monks, and diplomats who carried bolts of silk and jars of spice. And the cumulative effect of this movement, over the span of many centuries, was to gradually narrow the technological and intellectual gaps between civilizations that had, at the start of this period, developed largely in isolation from one another. This is perhaps the least romanticized and most historically important function the Silk Road actually served, more important in the long run than any individual shipment of luxury goods. And it happened not through any single dramatic transmission, but through the accumulated, generation after generation, movement of ordinary people carrying extraordinary knowledge without necessarily understanding its full significance. The political landscape overseeing all of this activity remained in a state of near constant flux, and this instability is worth dwelling on, because it shaped the psychology of everyone who depended on the route for their livelihood. A merchant setting out from Qian toward the Mediterranean in the 2nd century might expect to pass through territory controlled by perhaps 6 or 7 distinct political authorities, and by the time he made a return journey years later, several of those authorities might have been replaced entirely, their territories absorbed by rival powers, their tax structures and toll systems rewritten, their relationships with neighboring states transformed from alliance to hostility or the reverse. the Xiongnu Confederation that had originally driven Zhang Qian's mission gave way, over subsequent centuries, to a succession of other steppe powers, the Xi'an Bei, the Rouran, the Gokturks, each rising and declining in a rhythm that merchants had to learn to read and anticipate as a basic condition of their profession, in much the same way a modern sailor learns to read weather patterns not as isolated events but as recurring systems with their own internal logic. This constant political churn produced a particular kind of practical wisdom among the merchants who thrived within it, a wisdom that had less to do with loyalty to any specific ruler or empire and more to do with a kind of professional agnosticism about political authority itself. Sogdian merchants in particular became known across multiple historical sources, spanning several centuries and several different host civilizations, for a remarkable capacity to adapt their commercial and even religious presentation to whatever political and cultural context they found themselves operating within, adopting Buddhist patronage in one city, Zoroastrian practice in another, Manichaean or Nestorian Christian affiliation in a third, not necessarily as a matter of shallow opportunism but as a genuine, practiced flexibility born of lives spent moving between worlds that demanded different forms of belonging. This was survival, refined over generations into something closer to an inherited cultural skill, passed from parent to child alongside the more obvious commercial techniques of appraising silk quality or negotiating currency, exchange rates between the wildly varying coinages of a dozen different political territories. By the height of the Tang dynasty, the infrastructure and social technology supporting this trade had reached a level of sophistication that would not be matched again in the region for centuries, not until the Mongol unification of the 13th century created, for a relatively brief historical window, something resembling a single political authority spanning the entire length of the route. Tang China maintained an extensive system of relay stations, granted formal legal status and protections to foreign merchant communities residing within its borders, and developed customs and taxation systems sophisticated enough to generate detailed records, some of which survive today and provide historians with granular, almost mundane data about the actual quantities and categories of goods moving through specific border crossings in specific years, records that read less like the stuff of legend and more like what they actually were, the bureaucratic paperwork of an economy that, for all its exoticism in the modern imagination, functioned according to the same basic principles of taxation, regulation, and administrative record-keeping that govern trade in any complex pre-modern state. The specific texture of daily commerce along the route, once the larger political scaffolding was in place, is worth dwelling on in some detail, because the popular imagination tends to compress an enormously varied and specialized economic system into a single undifferentiated image of camel caravans laden with silk. In practice, the goods moving along these routes reflected an intricate division of specialization that had developed across centuries of accumulated market knowledge. Chinese exports extended well beyond silk to include lacquerware, ceramics that would later, in a much more intensive form, define an entirely separate maritime trading system, iron and steel implements whose quality Central Asian and Persian smiths struggled for centuries to match, and cinnamon and other goods that had themselves arrived in China from further south and east, absorbed into the Chinese export economy and passed further westward, so that the same object might change hands and change identity, in a sense, 3 or 4 times before reaching its final buyer, each intermediary adding value, risk, and profit margin along the way. Central Asian regions contributed the famous horses of Fergana, jade from the region around Khotan, a stone so prized in Chinese culture that its acquisition had motivated Chinese westward expansion for reasons only loosely related to the silk trade at all, and a wide range of furs, felts, and pastoral goods drawn from the surrounding steppe economies. From India came spices, ivory, precious stones, and cotton textiles that would themselves eventually rival silk in certain markets. From Persia and the Mediterranean world came glassware, wine, wool textiles, and coral, along with, crucially, the silver and gold coinage that Roman moralists so bitterly lamented seeing drained eastward. Understanding the actual mechanics of a single trading transaction along this route reveals a level of practical sophistication that belies any lingering assumption of pre-modern economic simplicity. A merchant arriving in an oasis city with a caravan of goods did not simply set up a stall and sell to whoever happened by. Trade was mediated through established marketplaces, often centered around a caravanserai or a dedicated commercial district, where local brokers, who had spent years or decades building relationships with both resident merchant communities and the itinerant traders passing through, served as essential intermediaries, providing crucial market intelligence about current prices, currency exchange rates, the reliability of particular local buyers, and the political conditions that might affect onward travel. These brokers took a commission, naturally, but their services were considered essential, rather than exploitative by most participants in the system, since the alternative, a foreign merchant attempting to navigate an unfamiliar market entirely on his own, without local knowledge or local reputation, was recognized by everyone involved as a recipe for being systematically cheated. Currency itself presented a persistent and fascinating challenge, since no single monetary system held sway across the entire length of the route, and merchants had to develop a working fluency in an enormous variety of coinages, weights, and measures, along with the more abstract but equally essential skill of understanding relative value across radically different economic contexts. Byzantine gold coins, Sasanian silver drams, and later, Islamic dinars and dirhams all circulated at various points along the route, sometimes accepted directly by weight and purity of metal regardless of the specific minting authority, a pragmatic workaround that allowed commerce to continue functioning, even when the political entity that had issued a particular coin had since collapsed or been absorbed by a rival power. Chinese currency, by contrast, operated on a fundamentally different logic for much of this history, relying on bronze coins valued by count rather than weight, along with, especially from the Tang dynasty onward, an increasingly sophisticated system of paper credit instruments that Central Asian and Middle Eastern merchants found genuinely remarkable when they encountered it, since nothing quite like state-backed paper currency existed anywhere else along the route, until many centuries later. The physical experience of the caravan itself deserves its own careful attention, because it shaped, in very concrete ways, the psychological and social world that produced everything discussed so far. A significant caravan might include anywhere from a few dozen to, in the largest and most heavily guarded cases, several thousand pack animals, predominantly Bactrian camels in the more arid and mountainous central stretches of the route, animals whose specific physiological adaptations, the double hump for fat storage, the capacity to close their nostrils against blinding sand, the thick eyelashes and specialized eyelids, made overland Eurasian trade at this scale physically possible in the first place. The domestication and specialized breeding of these camels represents its own quiet technological achievement, one rarely credited with the significance it deserves, since without an animal capable of carrying several 100 pounds of cargo across days of desert travel with minimal water, the entire economic system this account has been describing would have been simply impossible, regardless of how sophisticated the trust, networks or credit instruments built around it became. Caravan organization followed patterns refined across centuries of accumulated practical experience. A caravan master, often but not always the individual, with the largest personal stake in the goods being transported, held authority over the day's pace, the choice of campsite, the allocation of increasingly scarce water in difficult stretches, and crucially, decisions about when to press forward, despite danger, and when caution required delay or an alternate route. This authority was not absolute in any legal sense, since the merchants traveling together were typically independent, economic actors bound by mutual interest and shared risk rather than any formal hierarchy. But in practice, the caravan masters accumulated experience and local knowledge commanded a functional deference that mattered enormously to collective survival. Disputes did arise, inevitably, among groups of strong-willed, financially invested men making decisions under genuine physical stress, and the surviving legal and quasi-legal documents from various points along the route, including some remarkably detailed contracts preserved in the dry climate of the Darim Basin, reveal that partnership agreements often specified in advance how disputes would be resolved, what portion of losses each party would absorb in the event of theft or animal death, and what obligations survived even if one partner died mid-journey, a grim but practical necessity given the genuine mortality risks involved. It is worth pausing to consider what such a journey actually felt like, hour by hour, for the people undertaking it, because the abstraction of trade, statistics and political chronology can obscure the sheer physical and sensory reality of pre-modern overland travel across some of the most extreme terrain on the planet. Days began before dawn, in the cold hours when pack animals were most tractable and travel through desert stretches could avoid the worst of the midday heat. The rhythm of walking, for those without horses, or riding, for those who could afford them, settled into a kind of meditative monotony punctuated by moments of acute alertness. A distant dust cloud that might indicate bandits or might indicate nothing at all. A water source that might have dried since the last caravan passed through. A change in the color of the sky that experienced travelers had learned to read as warning of a sandstorm still hours away. Conversation, when it happened, moved between practical matters, the condition of the animals, the estimated distance to the next reliable water source, and something closer to genuine human connection, the kind that develops naturally among people sharing sustained physical hardship. Stories told in fragmented, multilingual exchanges, patched together from whatever words were mutually understood, gestures filling the considerable gaps. The role of religious and spiritual practice within this daily rhythm deserves particular emphasis, because it was not, for most travelers, a separate or occasional activity but something woven continuously into the texture of the journey itself. Buddhist travelers might pause at wayside shrines that had accumulated, can by can, offering by offering, across centuries of use by travelers whose names and specific circumstances had long since been forgotten but whose accumulated devotional practice had transformed an ordinary rock outcropping into a recognized sacred site. Muslim travelers, in the centuries following the 7th century rise of Islam and its rapid spread across Persia and Central Asia, structured their days around the fixed prayer times, a practice that, whatever its theological significance, also provided a reliable psychological anchor, a recurring structure of pause and reflection built into days that otherwise offered little natural rhythm beyond the position of the sun and the physical demands of the animals. Older, more syncretic practices persisted as well, particular routes and passes accumulating reputations across generations of oral transmission among caravan drivers as being protected or endangered by specific spirits or local deities, reputations that shaped route selection in ways that a purely economic analysis of the trade would entirely miss, since a caravan master choosing a slightly longer but spiritually reputed safer path was making a decision that blended practical risk assessment with genuine cosmological belief in ways that are, from a modern vantage point, difficult to fully disentangle, and perhaps were never meant to be disentangled at all by the people making these choices in the first place. It was into this world, stable enough to sustain routine travel and dense enough with cross-cultural contact to produce genuine intimacy between strangers, and yet still fundamentally unpredictable, still shaped by forces no individual merchant could fully control or anticipate, that the deeper human story of the Silk Road actually unfolded, a story less concerned with which empire controlled which oasis in which decade and more concerned with the accumulated weight of individual choices, attachments, betrayals, and adaptations that together constituted what it actually meant to live, a life defined by distance, difference, and the perpetual necessity of trust extended toward strangers. The role of the Buddhist pilgrim scholar deserves particular attention within this broader narrative of the roots development, since figures like the Chinese monk Xuanzang, whose 17-year journey to India and back in the 7th century became one of the most celebrated individual travel accounts in pre-modern Chinese literature, illustrate a category of Silk Road traveler distinct from the merchant but utterly dependent on the same infrastructure of caravanserais, translation networks, and cross-cultural hospitality that merchants had built and sustained. Xuanzang's motivation was explicitly religious and scholarly rather than commercial, a desire to obtain more accurate and complete Buddhist texts directly from their source in India, where doctrinal traditions had developed with a depth and complexity that Chinese Buddhist communities, working from incomplete and sometimes poorly translated texts, recognized as exceeding what had reached them secondhand. His journey, undertaken initially without official government permission, since Tang authorities had temporarily restricted travel beyond the western frontier for political reasons, required him to travel covertly through the earliest stages of his route, evading border patrols in scenes that his later biographers rendered with considerable dramatic flourish, though the underlying reality, a scholar risking serious punishment to pursue knowledge he believed essential, requires no exaggeration to remain genuinely compelling. What Xuanzang's account reveals, beyond its considerable value as a source of geographic and cultural information about 7th century Central Asia and India, is the depth of intellectual and spiritual motivation that supplemented purely commercial incentive. In driving movement along these routes, he visited monasteries, debated with scholars, collected manuscripts, and eventually returned to China with hundreds of Buddhist texts that he and a team of collaborators spent the remainder of his life translating, a scholarly project of such significance that it fundamentally reshaped the subsequent development of Chinese Buddhism. This pattern, in which the Silk Road functioned as a conduit for intellectual and spiritual ambition, every bit as much as commercial ambition, recurs throughout the route's history, and it is worth remembering that the caravans carrying silk and spice frequently carried, in the same train of pack animals, monks, scholars, and pilgrims whose motivations had nothing to do with profit, people who nonetheless depended entirely on the same infrastructure of trust, hospitality, and cross-cultural accommodation that merchant activity had built and sustained across the centuries. The diplomatic dimension of Silk Road travel, distinct from both commerce and religious pilgrimage, though frequently intertwined with both, also deserves attention, since formal diplomatic missions between the various empires and kingdoms connected by these routes represented another significant category of long-distance travel, one that often carried enormous political stakes and that could, depending on its outcome, reshape the political and economic conditions under which merchant activity subsequently operated. Byzantine embassies to various Central Asian powers, Chinese missions to Persia and beyond, and countless smaller diplomatic exchanges between the various kingdoms and khanates along the route generated their own substantial category of surviving historical documentation, since diplomatic missions, unlike the largely undocumented activities of ordinary merchants, typically produced official reports intended for preservation in royal or imperial archives. These diplomatic accounts, self-interested and often exaggerated in ways that require careful historical interpretation, nonetheless provide valuable, corroborating detail for the broader picture of political relationships, military capabilities, and cultural conditions that this account has drawn from a wider range of sources. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not resemble the loneliness of isolation, because it occurs constantly in the presence of other people, and this was, perhaps more than any other single psychological condition, the defining interior experience of life along the Silk Road. A merchant might spend 3 years in near constant human company, sleeping shoulder to shoulder with fellow travelers in caravanserai courtyards, sharing meals, sharing risk, sharing the particular intimacy that develops between people who depend on one another for physical survival, and still return home, if he returned at all, carrying a loneliness that had nothing to do with the absence of company and everything to do with the absence of being fully known. Every relationship formed on the road existed under a kind of built-in impermanence. You might learn a fellow trader's face, his habits, the particular way he prayed or complained or negotiated, across months of shared travel, and never learn his family's names, never see the place he called home, never know him across the full arc of a human life the way you might know a childhood neighbor or a lifelong colleague. The road produced deep, functional, even affectionate relationships that were nonetheless structurally shallow, bounded by the transaction or the journey that had created them. And this produced in many long-distance traders, if the surviving personal letters and later literary reflections are any indication, a particular psychological adaptation, a capacity to form quick, warm, situational intimacy, while withholding the deeper vulnerability that requires time and continuity to develop. This adaptation had real costs, and the historical record, fragmentary as it is, preserves traces of those costs in ways that are easy to miss if one is reading only for the grand narrative of trade and empire. The Sogdian letters recovered from the abandoned watchtower near Dunhuang, mentioned earlier in the context of the merchant's wife Miune, and not unique in their emotional content. Other surviving fragments of personal correspondence from across the Silk Road world, preserved by accident in the arid climate that mummified paper and parchment far better than the humid regions of Europe or southern China, reveal a recurring set of anxieties, debts unpaid across years and thousands of miles, children who had grown from infancy to near adulthood during a father's single extended trading expedition, fathers who returned home to sons who did not recognize them and daughters who had been married off in their absence, decisions made by mothers or uncles who could not wait years for a patriarch's approval on matters that could not be postponed. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the mundane practicality of these documents, the way they discuss debts and marriages and household matters in the same flat, businesslike tone, because the writers themselves seem to have understood these separations not as tragic exceptions but as the ordinary cost of the life they had chosen or inherited. The psychology of trust itself, which has already been discussed as an economic and logistical necessity, deserves deeper examination as a lived, embodied experience, because trusting a stranger with your entire livelihood, repeatedly, across a lifetime, is not a neutral or easy thing for a human nervous system to do. Evolutionary psychologists, studying trust and reciprocity in small-scale societies, have long observed that human beings appear to have evolved cognitive systems finely tuned for tracking reputation and reciprocity within relatively small, stable social groups, the kind of groups that characterized most of human evolutionary history. The Silk Road merchant existed in a radically different social environment, one requiring the extension of substantial trust to people entirely outside any stable, reputation-tracking community, people he might meet once and never see again, people whose entire social context, family ties, and prior behavior were fundamentally illegible to him. And yet the system worked well enough and often enough to sustain nearly 2,000 years of continuous cross-continental trade, which suggests that the merchants and communities of the Silk Road developed cultural technologies, reputational networks, religious and ethical frameworks, and institutional mechanisms specifically engineered to compensate for the absence of the small group intimacy that human trust instincts evolved to expect. Religious institutions played a role here that is easy to underestimate if one thinks of faith primarily in terms of private belief rather than social function. A Buddhist monastery situated along a trade route was not merely a place of spiritual retreat. It was, in a very practical sense, a trust-generating institution, a neutral space governed by a code of conduct that transcended any individual merchants, ethnic or political loyalties, a place where a trader could deposit goods, arrange loans, or even leave behind vulnerable family members with some reasonable expectation that the monastery's reputation and institutional continuity would ensure fair treatment in ways that no individual stranger's promise could guarantee. The same logic applied, with local variations, to mosques along the routes controlled by various Islamic polities from the 7th century onward, and to the informal networks of co-religionists that Jewish traders, among others, maintained across the Mediterranean and into Central Asia, using shared religious law and shared textual authority as a substitute for the kind of state-enforced contract law that simply did not exist across such vast and politically fragmented territory. What emerges from close study of these mechanisms is a picture of human beings solving, through improvised and often ingenious social technology, a problem that modern economists would recognize immediately as a fundamental challenge of trade under conditions of weak institutional enforcement, sometimes called the problem of credible commitment. How does a person convince a stranger to trust them when there is no overarching authority capable of punishing betrayal, and when the parties involved may never interact again? The Silk Road's answer, refined across centuries of trial, error, and accumulated cultural wisdom, involved a layered combination of religious institutional trust, extended kinship and diaspora networks, reputational systems that spread information about reliable and unreliable traders along the same routes the goods themselves traveled, and a remarkably sophisticated set of commercial instruments, including standardized weights and measures, letters of credit, and partnership contracts that distributed risk in ways specifically designed to make betrayal less profitable than continued cooperation. But institutions and instruments only tell part of the story, because underneath the economic mechanics lay something more difficult to quantify, a set of individual psychological adaptations that allowed particular kinds of people to thrive in an environment that would have broken others. The successful long-distance merchant needed a specific temperament, a capacity to tolerate radical uncertainty for extended periods, to make peace with the likelihood of significant loss on any given expedition, to maintain functional relationships with people whose gods, languages, and customs might be entirely foreign, and to do all of this while separated from whatever stable community had originally formed his sense of identity. This temperament was not universally distributed, and the historical record, again fragmentary but suggestive, indicates that long-distance trading families often developed something like a specialized occupational culture passed down across generations, in which children were raised from an early age with the specific psychological and practical training necessary for this kind of life, learning multiple languages as a matter of course, learning to read unfamiliar social and religious customs quickly and accurately, learning to calculate risk not as an abstract mathematical exercise but as an embodied, intuitive skill developed through years of apprenticeship, alongside older relatives. There is also a darker undercurrent to this story that deserves honest acknowledgement, because the romantic image of the Silk Road as a peaceful conduit of cultural exchange, however true in its broad strokes, obscures the very real violence, exploitation, and human suffering that ran alongside the trade in silk and spices and ideas. Slavery was a persistent and significant feature of Silk Road commerce throughout its history, with human beings bought, sold, and transported alongside other goods across the same routes, sometimes as war captives, sometimes as debt slaves, sometimes as children sold by desperately poor families during famine or crisis. Central Asian and steppe slave markets fed demand in Persian, Byzantine, and Chinese territories across many centuries, and the same infrastructure of caravanserais and trade networks that facilitated the movement of silk and spice, facilitated the movement of enslaved human beings, a fact that sits uncomfortably, but truthfully alongside the more frequently celebrated stories of cultural exchange and cosmopolitan tolerance. Disease moved along these same routes with similarly devastating consequences. And the psychological experience of this deserves attention alongside its epidemiological significance. Merchants and travelers understood, in ways that predated any germ theory of disease, but were nonetheless grounded in accumulated practical observation, that certain cities and certain seasons carried elevated risks of sickness, that plague seemed to travel with trade caravans in patterns too consistent to be entirely coincidental. And this understanding added yet another layer of chronic anxiety to an already psychologically demanding existence. A trader setting out on a multi-year expedition was gambling not only his capital and his physical safety against bandits and geography, but his very survival against pathogens whose nature he did not understand but whose devastating effects he had likely witnessed firsthand in some city or caravan along a previous journey. Gender deserves particular attention in this psychological accounting, because the story of the Silk Road, as it has traditionally been told, centers overwhelmingly on male merchants, male rulers, and male religious figures, a bias that reflects the surviving documentary record more than it reflects historical reality. Women were essential participants in this world in ways the traditional narrative often obscures. They ran households and businesses during the years-long absences of husbands and sons. As the letters of Mune and others attest, they served, particularly in the oasis cities, as the operators of inns, the managers of workshops, and in some documented cases, as merchants and property owners in their own right, particularly in Central Asian and Chinese legal contexts where women's property rights, while still constrained by patriarchal norms, were often more substantial than later medieval European systems would allow. Royal and noble women were frequently deployed as instruments of diplomatic alliance, married across vast distances into foreign courts in arrangements that, whatever their political utility to the men negotiating them, required these women to undertake journeys of extraordinary difficulty and to build entire new lives among people whose language and customs they had to learn essentially from scratch, often while pregnant, often while grieving the family and homeland left behind, often while navigating court politics in a foreign language they had been given little time to master. The philosophical dimension of all this, if one steps back from the granular human detail, points toward a genuinely profound observation about the nature of human civilization itself. The great empires of this era, Han and Tang China, Parthian and Sasanian Persia, the Kushan realm, the Byzantine successor to Rome, each imagined itself, in its official self-conception, as the civilized center of the world, surrounded by barbarism and disorder at its periphery, and yet the actual mechanism by which these civilizations remained connected to and enriched by one another, the actual infrastructure of cultural, technological, and intellectual exchange that allowed Buddhist philosophy to reach China, papermaking to reach Europe, mathematical and astronomical knowledge to circulate across the entire breadth of Eurasia, was built not by these self-important imperial centers but by the despised, itinerant, culturally mongrel merchant classes that imperial elites frequently viewed with suspicion and disdain. Confucian officials in China ranked merchants at the very bottom of the traditional social hierarchy, below peasants and artisans, precisely because merchant wealth was seen as unproductive and merchant loyalty as inherently suspect, tied to profit rather than to land, lineage, or state. And yet it was these same merchants, moving quietly and continuously across the very borders that imperial ideology insisted separated civilization from barbarism, who did more than any army or any court scholar to actually connect the disparate civilizations of pre-modern Eurasia into something resembling a single, interdependent world. This is, perhaps, the deepest and most quietly ironic truth embedded in the hidden social history of the Silk Road. The people who built the actual connective tissue of the pre-modern world were, almost without exception, the people their own societies considered marginal, suspect, or unworthy of serious historical attention. People who succeeded precisely because they had learned to live comfortably in the spaces between fixed identities, spaces that more settled and more privileged members of their own societies were never required to navigate and, consequently, never developed the psychological flexibility to survive within the literary and artistic record left behind by this world. Fragmentary as it is, offers another window into its interior psychology, one that formal trade histories tend to overlook in favor of customs, receipts and diplomatic correspondence. Poetry composed by Persian and Central Asian writers of the medieval period frequently returns to the theme of the traveler, the wanderer whose separation from home becomes a metaphor for a more general human condition of exile and longing. This was not merely literary convention borrowed and repeated, without lived experience behind it. The poets writing these lines were frequently drawing on direct or inherited family experience of the itinerant merchant life and the specific texture of their imagery. The caravan bell heard receding into distance, the single lamp burning in a caravanserai window glimpsed from the road at dusk. The particular quality of homesickness that comes not from missing a place but from missing a version of oneself left behind in that place years earlier, suggests writers working from something considerably more grounded than abstract literary tradition. Music, too, carried this psychological weight across the trade routes in ways that are almost entirely lost to direct historical reconstruction, but that surface in scattered textual references and in the instruments themselves, several of which spread along Silk Road routes and were adopted, adapted, and transformed by successive cultures in ways that mirror the broader pattern of technological and religious transmission already discussed. The pipa, a Chinese stringed instrument whose ancestry traces back through Central Asian instruments carried along the trade route centuries earlier, represents in its very physical form a kind of frozen record of cultural contact, its pear-shaped body and finger-plucked strings reflecting Central Asian origins later, thoroughly absorbed into Chinese musical tradition to the point where its foreign origins are, again, largely forgotten by those who now consider it authentically native. Musicians themselves, along with dancers, acrobats, and other performers, traveled the same routes as merchants, sometimes as independent professionals seeking patronage in wealthy oasis courts, sometimes as part of larger merchant retinues who valued entertainment during the long, monotonous stretches of desert travel. And their presence in the historical record, however fragmentary, reminds us that the Silk Road carried aesthetic pleasure and emotional release, alongside its more obviously transactional cargo, the specific psychological dynamics of cross-cultural marriage and family formation along the trade routes deserve deeper examination than the traditional trade-focused narrative typically allows, because these relationships, formed across barriers of language, religion, and expected duration of stay, produced a genuinely distinctive category of human experience. Consider the practical reality facing a Sogdian merchant who had established a secondary household in a Chinese border town, a not uncommon arrangement, documented in various administrative and legal records from the period. Such a man existed in a state of divided loyalty and divided identity that modern concepts of monogamous, geographically stable family life do not easily accommodate. His children by a local wife would grow up bilingual, bicultural, occupying a social position that was neither fully accepted within the dominant local culture nor fully connected to their father's distant homeland, a liminal status that historians of the period have found reflected in burial practices, naming conventions, and religious observance patterns that blend elements from multiple traditions in ways too consistent and too widespread to be dismissed as isolated anomalies. This liminality, uncomfortable as it may have been for the individuals living it, also produced a distinctive kind of cultural expertise that became, over generations, a genuinely valuable and marketable skill in its own right. Children raised in these mixed households often possessed a native fluency in multiple languages, and an intuitive, deeply internalized understanding of multiple cultural codes that no adult learner, however diligent, could fully replicate. Many of the most successful interpreters, diplomatic intermediaries, and cross-cultural brokers documented in the historical record of Silk Road cities appear to have come from precisely this kind of mixed background. Individuals whose personal identity crisis, in a sense, had been converted into professional capital, a pattern that speaks to something enduringly true about the relationship between displacement and adaptive skill, one that echoes across many different historical contexts far removed from medieval Central Asia. The experience of aging and dying far from one's place of origin represents perhaps the starkest psychological dimension of this world, and it is worth sitting with directly rather than passing over quickly, because it touches on something close to a universal human anxiety about mortality and memory. Buddhist monastic records from cities along the trade routes include numerous references to the deaths of foreign merchants, sometimes accompanied by careful, almost tender documentation of the deceased's possessions, presumably compiled so that any eventual family member who might someday inquire could learn what had become of a father, brother, or son who had simply never returned. These records represent a kind of institutional compassion extended to strangers, a recognition, embedded in bureaucratic practice, that even a stranger's death deserved documentation and dignity, that even a life ended in a foreign land far from any blood relation deserved acknowledgement rather than anonymous disposal. There is something in this practice that speaks to a genuinely humane response to the structural loneliness the Silk Road imposed on so many of the people who depended on it for their livelihood, an attempt, however incomplete, to preserve some trace of individual dignity within a system that otherwise treated human beings, alongside silk and spice, primarily as units of economic activity. It is also worth considering, with appropriate care and without flattening the enormous diversity of individual experience into a single narrative, what motivated people to enter this life in the first place, since it clearly was not chosen lightly. Given the extraordinary hardship and risk involved, economic necessity certainly drove many participants. Younger sons in merchant families with limited prospects for inheritance, individuals from regions where agricultural land was scarce or already fully claimed by established families, people fleeing debt, political persecution, or simply the narrow, foreclosed future that awaited them in the place of their birth. But the historical and literary record also preserves, in fragments, evidence of something closer to genuine restlessness and curiosity, as a motivating force, a temperament drawn toward the unknown for its own sake, a psychological profile that appears across enough different individual accounts, from different centuries and different cultural backgrounds, to suggest it represents a genuine and recurring type of human character rather than mere retrospective romanticization. Some people, it seems, have always been drawn toward the horizon simply because it is there, because the alternative, a life lived entirely within the boundaries of a single familiar landscape, felt to them like a kind of quiet suffocation that the very real dangers of the road were, for these particular temperaments, preferable to enduring. The question of how individual merchants manage the psychological weight of chronic, sustained risk deserves further consideration, since the personality traits and coping mechanisms that allowed some people to thrive under these conditions, while others abandoned the trade after a single catastrophic loss, offer genuine insight into human resilience under conditions of profound and irreducible uncertainty. Surviving merchant manuals and practical guides, several of which have been preserved from various periods and regions along the trade routes, reveal a striking emphasis on diversification and risk distribution as both practical strategy and psychological discipline. Advice to never commit the entirety of one's capital to a single caravan or a single commodity, to maintain relationships across multiple trading partners rather than depending entirely on any single alliance, and to accept, as a fundamental condition of the profession, that significant Losses would occur periodically, and that emotional equanimity in the face of such losses was itself a professional skill to be cultivated rather than a personal failing to be overcome through willpower alone. This represents, in its own pre-modern vocabulary, a genuinely sophisticated understanding of risk management that anticipates, in striking ways, principles that would not be formally articulated in Western economic theory until many centuries later. The 13th century brought, paradoxically, both the most catastrophic violence the Silk Road had ever witnessed, and the most stable, unified, and in some respects prosperous period in its entire history. And understanding how these two facts coexist requires setting aside any simple narrative of decline or destruction. The Mongol conquests, beginning under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century and continuing under his successors for several generations afterward, produced death and devastation on a scale that is difficult to convey without either understating the horror or slipping into the kind of numerical abstraction that makes suffering unimaginable rather than comprehensible. Cities across Central Asia that had taken centuries to build their wealth, their libraries, their irrigation systems, their accumulated craft and commercial knowledge, were destroyed within days when they resisted Mongol demands for submission. Merv, once among the largest and most sophisticated cities in the entire Islamic world, a center of learning that had housed extraordinary libraries and a population that some estimates place well over 100,000, was destroyed so thoroughly in 1221 that some later chroniclers described the event using language typically reserved for divine punishment or cosmic catastrophe, and the city never fully recovered its former stature. And yet, once the initial conquest had passed and the Mongol Empire had consolidated its control over the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe, something unexpected happened, something that historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, a term borrowed by obvious analogy from the Roman peace. For roughly a century, beginning in the mid-13th century, a single political structure, however brutal its origins, and however fractious its internal politics, eventually became controlled territories spanning virtually the entire length of the Silk Road. A merchant could, in theory, travel from the Mediterranean coast to the Pacific Ocean under the jurisdiction of Mongol successor states the entire way, without needing to negotiate passage through the dozens of independent political authorities that had previously fragmented the route. Mongol rulers, whatever their reputation for battlefield violence, understood with remarkable clarity that trade generated tax revenue and tribute, and Mongol administrations, across their various khanates, actively protected and promoted merchant travel, establishing standardized systems of passports and travel documents, maintaining relay stations with fresh horses at intervals along major routes, and imposing genuinely severe punishments on bandits who preyed on merchant caravans within their territory. This is the world that produced the most famous individual travel account in the entire history of the Silk Road, the journey of Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who, along with his father and uncle, traveled to the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan in the late 13th century and reportedly spent roughly 17 years in Mongol service before returning to Venice. Marco Polo's account, dictated to a fellow prisoner while Polo was held captive following a naval battle between Venice and Genoa, became one of the most widely circulated travel narratives in medieval Europe, and its descriptions of Chinese wealth, sophistication, and scale were so far beyond what medieval European readers could readily imagine that the book was, 4 centuries afterward, regarded by many readers as at least partially fictional, a suspicion that later historical and archaeological research has done a great deal to dispel, even as certain specific details of Polo's account remain subjects of genuine scholarly debate. What Polo's account reveals, beyond its individual details, is the psychological experience of a European encountering, for the first time in any documented and widely circulated form, the true scale and sophistication of the civilizations that lay at the eastern end of the trade routes his own society had been trading through, indirectly and at enormous remove, for well over 1,000 years, without ever really understanding what lay at the other end. But the very forces that made the Pax Mongolica possible, the unification of vast territories under centralized authority and their resulting freedom of movement across previously fragmented political boundaries, also created the conditions for the single most devastating event in the entire recorded history of the Silk Road, an event whose consequences would ultimately outlast the Mongol Empire itself by centuries: the unified transportation networks that allowed merchants to move with unprecedented speed and freedom across the length of Eurasia also allowed disease to move with the same unprecedented speed and freedom, and sometime in the early 14th century, likely originating among marmot populations in the steppes of Central Asia that had long served as a natural reservoir for the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Plague began moving westward along the same trade routes that had, for over a millennium, carried silk, spices, paper, and ideas. The specific mechanics of how plague entered the historical record as a documented catastrophe are worth dwelling on, because they illustrate with terrible clarity the double-edged nature of the connectivity the Silk Road had spent centuries building. The Mongol siege of the Genos trading post of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula in 1346 has become, in popular historical memory, something close to ground zero for the plague's entry into Europe, with later chroniclers describing besieging Mongol forces catapulting the bodies of plague victims over the city walls in a deliberate act of biological warfare, though modern historians debate both the accuracy and the actual epidemiological significance of this particular account, since fleas carried on rats aboard merchant ships were likely a more consequential vector than any deliberate catapulting of corpses. What is not in dispute is that Genos merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the disease westward by ship into Mediterranean ports, and from there it spread with horrifying speed across Europe, killing, according to most modern historical estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of the entire European population within a span of just a few years, a mortality event whose scale would not be approached again in European history until the 20th century's world wars. The plague's movement westward along maritime and overland trade routes represents, in the starkest possible terms, the fundamental vulnerability built into any highly connected system, whether that system is a pre-modern trade network or, for that matter, a modern globalized economy. The same infrastructure of movement, trust, and exchange that had spent centuries enriching the civilizations connected by the Silk Road became, almost overnight, the vector for a catastrophe that would kill tens of millions of people across 3 continents. Contemporary observers, working without any germ theory of disease but not without considerable powers of observation, frequently noted the correlation between trade routes and the spread of the sickness, and this observation had real consequences, contributing to a gradual and long-lasting suspicion of foreign traders and foreign goods that would linger in various forms across European society for generations afterward, a suspicion that sits in uncomfortable but historically honest tension with the genuine cosmopolitanism and cross-cultural exchange that had characterized the Silk Road at its height. The Mongol Empire itself, weakened by the same plague that was devastating Europe and further strained by internal succession conflicts and the practical difficulties of governing such an enormous and diverse territory, began fragmenting into competing khanates during the latter half of the 14th century, and this fragmentation brought a return of exactly the kind of political instability and multiplied border crossings that had made overland trade so unpredictable and dangerous in earlier centuries. The brief window of unified, relatively safe passage across the entire length of Eurasia, which had made possible journeys like Marco Polo's, closed. and it would not reopen in anything resembling the same form. Into this increasingly fragmented and dangerous landscape stepped a figure, whose career represents, in many ways, both the last great flowering of Silk Road military and political power and a preview of the route's eventual eclipse. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose to power in Central Asia in the latter half of the 14th century and, over the following decades, built an empire through military campaigns of extraordinary brutality. Campaigns that in some regions of Persia and Central Asia produced destruction and population loss on a scale that rivaled or exceeded the earlier Mongol conquests. And yet Timur, ruling from his capital at Samarkand, also presided over a genuine cultural flowering, patronizing architecture, scholarship, and the arts in ways that transformed Samarkand into one of the most magnificent cities in the entire Islamic world. Its blue-tile domes and elaborate madrasas, standing as monuments to a wealth and sophistication, built directly on the continued, if increasingly precarious, functioning of the trade routes that ran through Timurid territory. The deeper transformation that would ultimately render the overland Silk Road obsolete, however, was not military or political but technological and maritime, and it unfolded gradually across the 15th and 16th centuries in a process that few people living through its early stages could have fully recognized for what it was. European navigators, driven by a combination of commercial ambition, religious motivation, and technological innovation in shipbuilding and navigation, began developing sea routes that could connect European markets directly to South and East Asian sources of silk, spice, and other luxury goods, without requiring passage through the multiple overland intermediaries, the Central Asian Khanates, the Persian territories, the various tolls and taxes and risks that had characterized overland trade for 2,000 years, Portuguese navigators rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and the subsequent development of extensive European maritime trading networks throughout the Indian Ocean and eventually into the Pacific, offered a fundamentally more efficient alternative to overland transport, one capable of moving vastly larger quantities of goods at vastly lower cost per unit, even accounting for the very real dangers of long ocean voyages. This transition did not happen overnight, and overland trade along various stretches of the old Silk Road routes continued in diminished and transformed forms for centuries afterward, adapting to new political realities, new regional markets, and new patterns of demand that had little to do with the original silk and spice trade that had given the network its eventual romantic name, but the fundamental economic logic that had sustained the overland route as the primary conduit for long-distance Eurasian trade had been permanently altered, and the cities and communities whose entire existence had been built around servicing and profiting from that overland trade faced a slow, uneven, but ultimately decisive transformation, one that would leave some of the most magnificent cities of the medieval world, cities that had once stood at the absolute center of global commerce and cultural exchange, gradually receding into a kind of provincial obscurity that would only be reversed centuries later by the arrival of railways, oil, and modern geopolitics, forces entirely unrelated to the ancient logic of silk and camels and mountain passes that had first brought these places into being. The human experience of the plague years, for those living directly along the trade routes rather than in its eventual European destination, deserves its own careful attention, since the popular memory of this catastrophe tends to center almost exclusively on its European toll, obscuring the fact that Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and Chinese populations along the trade corridors suffered comparably devastating losses, sometimes preceding the European outbreak by years or even decades. Chinese sources from the 14th century document repeated epidemic outbreaks that modern epidemiological analysis strongly suggests were connected to the same disease pathway occurring in populations along the trade routes well before the disease reached the Crimean coast, and from there the Mediterranean world, the oasis cities that had built their prosperity on welcoming strangers and facilitating exchange between distant peoples found. This same openness, this same connectivity that had been the foundation of their wealth for centuries, transformed almost overnight into a source of mortal danger, a bitter irony that surely was not lost on the merchants, monks, and officials living through it, even if they lacked the scientific framework to fully understand the mechanism by which their prosperity and their peril had become, in this instance, one and the same phenomenon. The psychological aftershock of the plague years, though considerably less documented than its demographic toll, can be glimpsed in the shifting patterns of religious practice and social organization that emerged across affected regions in the decades following the worst outbreaks, flagellant movements in Europe, religious communities that turned toward increasingly severe and self-punishing devotional practices in response to what many understood as divine judgment, find echoes, though not exact equivalents, in shifts toward more austere and apocalyptically inflected religious movements in various Central Asian and Middle Eastern communities during the same general period, suggesting that mass mortality on this scale produced a kind of shared psychological and theological crisis that manifested differently according to local religious tradition, but that shared an underlying structure, an attempt to make some kind of moral or cosmic sense out of suffering and loss on a scale that defied ordinary explanation. Trust itself, that carefully constructed social technology that had taken centuries to develop and refine along the trade routes, suffered a genuine and lasting injury during this period, one that outlasted the epidemiological crisis by generations. Surviving merchant correspondence and legal records from the decades following the worst plague years reveal a marked increase in disputes over contracts, in accusations of fraud and bad faith among trading partners, and in the kind of defensive, suspicious commercial practices that suggest the underlying social fabric of reciprocal trust, so essential to the functioning of long-distance trade under conditions of weak institutional enforcement, had been genuinely strained by a crisis that had, quite literally, killed enormous numbers of the very people whose accumulated reputations and relationships had made the system function. Rebuilding this trust infrastructure took time, and some historians have argued that the gradual, multi-generational nature of this rebuilding process, combined with the increasing viability of maritime alternatives, contributed as much to the eventual decline of overland trade as any single dramatic political or technological factor. The story of Timur's empire, mentioned briefly already, deserves fuller treatment here, because it represents a genuinely important attempt, in the aftermath of both Mongol fragmentation and plague devastation, to rebuild something resembling the unified political stability that had made the Pax Mongolica possible. Timur's military campaigns, conducted across roughly 4 decades in the latter half of the 14th century and into the early 15th, ranged from Anatolia in the west to Delhi in the east, an astonishing scope of conquest that briefly reunited significant stretches of the old trade routes under a single political authority. But Timur's empire, unlike the earlier Mongol Khanates in their period of greatest stability, was held together far more by the personal military authority of its founder than by any durable administrative institution. And upon Timur's death in 1405, while preparing for a planned invasion of Ming China that would likely have reshaped the entire subsequent history of the trade routes had it occurred, his empire began the familiar process of fragmentation among competing heirs that had characterized the decline of virtually every major steppe empire before it. What followed Timur's death, under the rule of his son and eventual successor Shahrukh and Shahruk's own son, the astronomer king Ulugh Beg, represents one of the genuine high points of Central Asian intellectual and scientific culture, worth pausing on for its own sake, even as the broader trajectory of the overland trade routes continued its slow transformation. Ulugh Beg, ruling from Samarkand in the early 15th century, constructed one of the most sophisticated astronomical observatories in the pre-modern world, and the star catalogue produced by his court astronomers achieved a level of precision that would not be surpassed by European astronomers for well over a century afterward. This scientific flowering, funded substantially by the continued, if diminished, wealth generated by trade passing through Samarkand, offers a useful reminder that they, overland trade routes, did not simply collapse into irrelevance the moment maritime alternatives began to emerge, but rather continued to sustain genuine cultural and intellectual achievement for generations, even as their relative importance to the broader Eurasian economy gradually diminished. The maritime transition itself, when examined closely, reveals a more gradual and contested process than the clean narrative of technological supersession sometimes suggests. Overland and maritime trade coexisted and competed for well over a century, with different routes proving advantageous for different goods, different seasons, and different political circumstances. Bulk goods, heavy and low value relative to their weight, increasingly favored maritime transport, where a single ship could carry cargo that would have required dozens or hundreds of camels overland, at a fraction of the cost and with considerably lower risk of catastrophic loss to banditry or difficult terrain. But certain high-value, low-weight luxury goods, along with cultural and religious traffic that depended on established overland pilgrimage routes and existing networks of religious institutions, continued to favor the old paths for generations. After the broader economic logic had shifted decisively toward the sea, Central Asian Khanates that had once profited enormously from their position astride the primary Eurasian trade corridor found themselves, across the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, increasingly peripheral to a global economic system, now organized primarily around maritime shipping lanes, controlled by European powers whose ships could reach Chinese and Indian ports directly, bypassing entirely the elaborate chain of overland intermediaries that had defined Eurasian trade for the previous 2,000 years. This economic marginalization carried profound political consequences that unfolded across subsequent centuries. The Central Asian Khanates and city-states that had once stood at the absolute center of global commerce found their relative wealth and political significance steadily diminishing, a long, slow eclipse that made these territories increasingly vulnerable to conquest and absorption by expanding neighboring powers, first by various regional empires and eventually, in the 18th and 19th centuries, by the expanding Russian Empire, pushing southward and eastward across the very steppes and oases that had once hosted the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan trading cities in the pre-modern world. The Great Game, as the 19th century geopolitical rivalry between British and Russian imperial interests in Central Asia came to be known, unfolded across territory, whose earlier significance as the connective tissue of Eurasian civilization had been almost entirely forgotten by the imperial powers now contesting control over it, treating these ancient trade corridors as a strategic buffer zone, rather than recognizing them as the historically vital cultural and commercial center they had once been. What remained, after the overland routes lost their central place in global commerce, was not nothing, and it is important to resist the narrative temptation to treat the rise of maritime trade as a clean, historical ending, a curtain falling on a story now complete. The oasis cities that had once stood at the absolute center of Eurasian exchange did not vanish. Samarkand and Bukhara continued as regional centers of trade, scholarship, and Islamic learning for centuries afterward, their populations adapting to reduced but not eliminated commercial traffic, their architectural and cultural heritage continuing to accumulate, even as their relative importance on the world stage diminished. Many of the great mosques, madrasas, and mausoleums that draw visitors to these cities today were constructed not during the classical height of Silk Road trade but during the Timurid period and afterward, evidence that cultural and architectural Flourishing continued along these routes well past the point when their commercial centrality had begun to fade, sustained by regional trade, agricultural wealth, and the accumulated prestige of cities that had spent centuries building reputations as centers of learning and piety that outlasted their original commercial function. The deeper legacy of the Silk Road, though, lies less in any particular surviving city or monument and more in the diffuse, largely untraceable ways it permanently altered the civilizations it connected. The genetic, linguistic, culinary, and religious landscape of Eurasia bears the marks of this exchange in ways so thoroughly absorbed into what later generations would consider their own native traditions, that the foreign origin of these elements is often entirely forgotten. Noodles, a food closely associated in the modern popular imagination with both Italian and Chinese cuisine, likely developed independently in multiple locations, but the broader story of how spices, cooking techniques, and specific crops moved along these routes and permanently reshaped regional cuisines across Persia, India, China, and eventually Europe represents one of the most intimate and least visible forms of the Silk Road's lasting influence, embedded in something as basic and unexamined as what people eat and how they season it. Religious geography, too, bears permanent marks of this history. The presence of Islam across Central Asia, the historical patterns of Buddhist practice stretching from India through Central Asia into China, Korea, and Japan, the scattered but historically significant communities of various Christian traditions that once flourished as far east as the Chinese imperial court. All of these represent the long-term sedimentation of centuries of movement along trade routes that carried missionaries, pilgrims, and ordinary believers alongside merchants and their goods. The specific vocabulary of numerous languages across this vast region preserves loanwords tracing back to Silk Road contact, technical and commercial, terms borrowed across linguistic boundaries so long ago that most speakers using them today have no awareness of their foreign origin. Small linguistic fossils embedded in ordinary daily speech, evidence of contact so old and so thoroughly absorbed that it has become invisible, indistinguishable from what feels simply and naturally native. The scientific and technological legacy deserves equal weight in any honest accounting. The slow, generation-by-generation transmission of papermaking, printing techniques, gunpowder, the compass, advanced mathematics including the transmission of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system that eventually replaced Roman numerals across Europe, astronomical knowledge, and medical practices including elements of what would become the foundational pharmacological and surgical traditions of multiple civilizations, all moved along these routes across many centuries, and the cumulative effect of this transmission was to gradually knit together what had previously been largely separate zones of human technological and intellectual development into a single, interconnected system of knowledge, one in which innovation in any single region would eventually, given enough time, become available to societies thousands of miles away. This process, unglamorous and largely undocumented in any individual dramatic episode, arguably did more to shape the subsequent trajectory of world history than any single military conquest or dynastic succession that dominates more conventional historical narratives. There is also, in the 20th and 21st centuries, a more self-conscious and deliberate afterlife to consider. The way the Silk Road has been revived, rhetorically and sometimes literally, as a symbol and organizing concept for modern geopolitical and economic ambition. The very term itself, coined by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in the 19th century, reflects a distinctly modern, retrospective act of naming and narrative construction, imposed on a phenomenon that the people actually living through it would not have recognized as a single coherent thing at all. Contemporary infrastructure projects spanning Eurasia have explicitly invoked the historical memory of the Silk Road as inspiration and justification, an indication of how thoroughly this originally obscure and fragmented network of trade routes has been transformed, in modern imagination, into a powerful symbol of connectivity, exchange, and shared human civilization, even as the actual historical reality was, as this account has tried to show, considerably messier, more violent, more contingent, and more deeply human than the clean symbolic version that later generations have found useful to construct. What perhaps deserves final emphasis, in any honest reckoning with what was lost and what remained, is the sheer scale of ordinary human experience that the Silk Road generated, and that has left almost no direct trace in any historical record. For every Zhang Qian, every Marco Polo, every named figure whose journey happened to be recorded, remembered, and transmitted across the centuries, there were tens of thousands of unnamed merchants, wives, children, slaves, monks, translators, innkeepers, camel drivers, and border guards whose entire lived experience of this vast, interconnected world has vanished as completely as the fire that warmed 12 strangers in the Pamirs on a single cold night, leaving behind nothing but the accumulated, anonymous weight of their collective labor, embedded now in customs, cuisines, religions, and technologies that later generations would inherit without ever knowing whose hands, whose risk, whose loneliness, and whose quiet daily courage had actually built the world they were inheriting. The archaeological record, which continues to expand as excavation and research proceeds across the former Silk Road territories, has in recent decades revealed a considerably richer and more complex picture than earlier generations of historians, working primarily from limited textual sources, were able to construct. Excavations at sites across the Darim Basin have recovered mummified remains, remarkably preserved by the extreme aridity of the desert climate, whose genetic analysis reveals populations of mixed ancestry stretching back far earlier than the classical period of Silk Road trade, typically discussed, suggesting that the patterns of human movement and mixing this account has described were not a sudden development of the Han Dynasty period but rather an intensification of exchange patterns that had existed in less documented and less economically formalized ways for many centuries or even millennia before Zhang Qian's mission gave them official imperial sanction and historical documentation. Textile fragments recovered from burial sites along the routes offer another remarkably intimate window into this deep history, since cloth, unlike most other archaeological materials, carries within its weave and dye a detailed record of the specific technical knowledge and aesthetic preferences of the community that produced it. Chinese silk fragments discovered in burial contexts thousands of miles from China, in some cases dating to periods well before the formal opening of trade, routes that Zhang Qian's mission is traditionally credited with initiating, demonstrate that informal, small-scale exchange networks had been quietly moving valuable and technically sophisticated goods across enormous distances for generations before any imperial court took official notice or attempted to formalize and tax the process. This pattern, informal exchange preceding and in some sense enabling formal imperial trade policy, rather than the reverse, offers an important corrective to narratives that credit powerful states and famous individuals with creating connections that, in reality, ordinary people had already been quietly building for generations, often at considerable personal risk and with no expectation of historical recognition. The modern rediscovery and popularization of Silk Road history itself deserves brief reflection, since the very process by which this scattered, fragmentary, and often deliberately obscured history became a coherent and widely recognized historical narrative reveals something about how collective memory and historical understanding actually develop over time. 19th and early 20th century European and Japanese explorers and archaeologists, operating within colonial and semi-colonial political frameworks that this account has not shied from, acknowledging elsewhere, conducted extensive excavations across Central Asia and Western China, removing enormous quantities of manuscripts, artwork, and artifacts to museums and libraries in London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo. A process that, whatever its genuine contributions to historical knowledge, also represents its own chapter in the long history of unequal power relationships between different regions of Eurasia, one that continues to generate legitimate contemporary debate about cultural heritage, restitution, and the ethics of archaeological practice, conducted under conditions of significant political and economic asymmetry between excavating and excavated nations. Among the most significant of these rediscoveries was the Mogao cave complex near Dunhuang, a site that had served for roughly a millennium as a center of Buddhist devotion and artistic production, precisely because of its position along the trade routes, its cave temples decorated with Buddhist murals and sculptures, created by generations of artists whose techniques and iconographic conventions reveal, layer upon layer across different historical periods, the accumulating influence of Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese artistic traditions blending and evolving together across centuries of continuous use. A sealed library cave, discovered at the site in the early 20th century, contained tens of thousands of manuscripts, some dating back over 1,000 years, written in numerous languages and scripts, preserving everything from Buddhist religious texts to mundane commercial contracts, to personal letters, not unlike those of the merchant's wife Mune discussed earlier, a genuinely extraordinary, accidental time capsule that has since occupied generations of scholars, working to catalogue, translate, and interpret its contents, work that continues today and that regularly produces new insights into the granular, lived texture of Silk Road society that this account has attempted to convey.